In the heart of Maplewood Lane, where the houses stood shoulder to shoulder like old friends, Miss Johnson's garden was a vibrant tapestry of colors. Each morning, she would step outside, the sun warming her skin, and tend to her flowers with a gentle touch. Bright marigolds danced in the breeze, while sunflowers stood tall, their faces turned toward the sky. The garden was not just a collection of plants, it was a reflection of her spirit, a testament to her resilience and love for life. However, not everyone appreciated her efforts. Mr. Thompson, her neighbor to the right, had a different perspective. He was a man of rigid opinions and a penchant for conformity. To him, Miss Johnson's garden was an eyesore, a chaotic splash of color that disrupted the otherwise uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. He often stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching her with a scowl, muttering under his breath about how things used to be better before she moved in. As the seasons changed, so did the tension between them. Mr. Thompson's complaints grew louder and more frequent. He would approach Miss Johnson with a forced smile, making snide remarks about her gardening skills. "You know, if you just trimmed those wildflowers, it might look a bit more respectable," he would say, his tone dripping with condescension. Miss Johnson would nod politely, her heart heavy with the weight of his words, but she refused to let his negativity dim her passion. One sunny afternoon, as she pruned her roses, she overheard Mr. Thompson speaking to another neighbor. "That garden is ruining property values," he declared, his voice filled with disdain. "It's not what this neighborhood needs." Miss Johnson felt a pang of hurt, but she also felt a spark of determination. She had worked hard to create a space that brought joy not only to herself but to others who passed by. Days turned into weeks, and the tension simmered beneath the surface. Then, one morning, Miss Johnson awoke to the sound of construction. She rushed outside, her heart racing, only to find Mr. Thompson erecting a tall wooden fence between their properties. "It's for privacy," he called out, a smirk on his face. The fence loomed over her garden like a dark cloud, blocking the sunlight and casting a shadow over her beloved flowers. Miss Johnson stood frozen, her heart sinking. The fence was not just a physical barrier, it was a symbol of the animosity that had been brewing between them. She felt a mix of anger and sadness, but deep down, she knew she couldn't let this stand. This was her home, her garden, and she would fight for it. As she stared at the fence, a plan began to form in her mind. She would not let Mr. Thompson's actions go unchallenged. It was time to take a stand, not just for herself, but for the community she loved. With renewed determination, she decided to organize a community meeting, a gathering where neighbors could come together to discuss the importance of their shared spaces and the beauty of diversity. Little did she know, this would be the first step in a journey that would not only change her life, but also the dynamics of the entire neighborhood. The days following the fence's construction were filled with a mix of frustration and resolve for Ms. Johnson. Each time she looked out her window, the imposing barrier reminded her of Mr. Thompson's disdain. But rather than succumbing to despair, she channeled her energy into planning the community meeting. She believed that if she could gather her neighbors, they could discuss not only the aesthetics of the neighborhood, but also the importance of unity and respect. With a determined heart, Ms. Johnson crafted flyers, carefully detailing the time and place of the meeting. She wrote about the significance of community gardens, the joy they brought, and how they could serve as a bridge between neighbors. She included a personal note, inviting everyone to share their thoughts and experiences. "Let's come together to celebrate our differences and find common ground," she wrote, hoping to inspire others to join her cause. As she distributed the flyers, she encountered mixed reactions. Some neighbors smiled and nodded, expressing their support, while others, influenced by Mr. Thompson's negativity, shrugged her off. "Why bother?" one neighbor said dismissively. "It's just a garden." But Ms. Johnson remained undeterred. She knew that this was about more than just flowers. It was about standing up against prejudice and fostering a sense of belonging. The day of the meeting arrived, and Ms. Johnson felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. She set up chairs in the community center, arranging them in a circle to encourage open dialogue. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, she wondered how many people would actually show up. Would they be willing to listen? Would they stand with her against Mr. Thompson's hostility? To her surprise, as the hour approached, neighbors began to trickle in. Familiar faces filled the room, and soon it was buzzing with conversation. Ms. Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over her as she greeted each person, thanking them for coming. Among the attendees were families with children, elderly couples, and even a few newcomers to the neighborhood. As the meeting began, Ms. Johnson stood at the front, her heart racing but her voice steady. "Thank you all for being here today," she started, her eyes scanning the room. "I wanted to talk about our neighborhood and how we can support one another. Recently, I've faced some challenges regarding my garden, and I believe it's important for us to discuss how we can create a more inclusive community." She shared her story, recounting the hurtful comments and the recent construction of the fence. The room fell silent, and she could see the expressions of empathy on her neighbors' faces. One by one, they began to share their own experiences, stories of feeling marginalized, of being judged for their differences, and of the beauty they found in diversity. As the discussion unfolded, it became clear that many shared Ms. Johnson's sentiments. They spoke passionately about the importance of community spaces, how gardens could serve as a sanctuary for everyone, and how they could bring people together. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension to one of solidarity, and Ms. Johnson felt a renewed sense of hope. Then, a voice broke through the crowd. It was Mrs. Ramirez, an elderly woman who had lived on Maplewood Lane for decades. "I remember when this neighborhood was filled with gardens," she said, her eyes sparkling with nostalgia. "We used to have block parties, and everyone would bring something from their garden to share. It was a celebration of our differences." The room erupted in agreement, and Ms. Johnson felt a surge of energy. This was what she had hoped for, a community coming together to reclaim their shared space. As the meeting continued, they brainstormed ideas for a neighborhood garden project, envisioning a place where everyone could contribute and enjoy the fruits of their labor. By the end of the meeting, Ms. Johnson felt a sense of triumph. They had not only discussed the garden but had also laid the groundwork for a stronger, more united community. As neighbors mingled and exchanged contact information, she caught sight of Mr. Thompson standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. But this time, she didn't feel intimidated. She felt empowered. With the support of her neighbors, Ms. Johnson knew they could confront the challenges ahead. The seeds of change had been planted, and she was ready to nurture them into something beautiful. Little did she know, the real test was yet to come. The following week, the energy from the community meeting lingered in the air like the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Ms. Johnson felt invigorated, buoyed by the support of her neighbors. They had decided to organize a neighborhood cleanup day, where everyone would come together to beautify the area and lay the groundwork for the community garden. Excitement buzzed through the neighborhood as families began to prepare for the event. However, not everyone was pleased with the newfound camaraderie. Mr. Thompson, who had been watching from the sidelines, felt increasingly threatened by the unity forming around Ms. Johnson. He had always prided himself on being the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood standards, and he was determined to put a stop to what he perceived as a rebellion against his vision of order. On the day of the cleanup, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over Maplewood Lane. Ms. Johnson arrived early, setting up tables with refreshments and gathering supplies for the volunteers. As neighbors began to arrive, she felt a swell of pride. Children laughed and played, while adults chatted and shared gardening tips. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled her heart with hope. But as the event got underway, Mr. Thompson appeared, striding down the street with an air of authority. He approached the gathering, arms crossed and a frown etched on his face. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the cheerful chatter. "This is just a waste of time. You're all going to ruin the neighborhood with this nonsense." The laughter and conversation fell silent as everyone turned to face him. Ms. Johnson felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she took a deep breath, reminding herself of the support she had. "We're coming together to clean up our neighborhood and create a community garden," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about celebrating our differences and making this place better for everyone." Mr. Thompson scoffed, shaking his head. "You think a garden is going to change anything? It's just a way to attract more people who don't belong here." His words dripped with disdain, and Ms. Johnson could feel the tension rising. But before she could respond, a neighbor stepped forward. It was Mr. Patel, a quiet man who had lived in the neighborhood for years. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, this garden is about more than just plants. It's about community, about coming together despite our differences. We all have a right to enjoy this space." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Mr. Patel's words. Ms. Johnson felt a surge of gratitude toward her neighbors, who were standing up for what was right. Mr. Thompson's face flushed with anger, but he was outnumbered. "Fine," he spat, his voice rising. "But don't say I didn't warn you. This will only bring trouble." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed away, leaving behind a palpable tension in the air. As the cleanup continued, Ms. Johnson felt a mix of relief and determination. The confrontation had been uncomfortable, but it had also solidified the community's resolve. They worked side by side, pulling weeds, planting seeds, and sharing laughter. The garden began to take shape, a symbol of their unity and resilience. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the newly turned soil, Ms. Johnson gathered everyone together. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This garden is a testament to our strength as a community. Together, we can create a space that welcomes everyone, regardless of their background." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Ms. Johnson felt a warmth spread through her heart. They had faced adversity, but they had also found strength in one another. The garden was not just a project, it was a movement, a declaration that they would not be silenced by prejudice. As the evening drew to a close, Ms. Johnson looked around at her neighbors, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of string lights. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but with the support of her community, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Justice was not just a distant dream, it was a reality they were building together, one flower at a time. But little did she know, Mr. Thompson was not finished yet. The confrontation had ignited a fire within him, and he was determined to reclaim his vision of the neighborhood, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed the cleanup, the community garden blossomed into a vibrant hub of activity. Neighbors gathered regularly to tend to the plants, share gardening tips, and enjoy each other's company. Ms. Johnson felt a sense of fulfillment as she watched the garden thrive, a living testament to their collective efforts. Children played among the rows of vegetables and flowers, their laughter echoing through the air, while adults exchanged stories and recipes, forging bonds that transcended their differences. However, the shadow of Mr. Thompson loomed large. He had become increasingly vocal in his opposition to the garden, rallying a small group of like-minded neighbors who shared his views. They began to spread rumors about the garden, claiming it attracted undesirable elements, and that it would lead to a decline in property values. Ms. Johnson heard whispers of their discontent, but she refused to let it deter her. The garden was a symbol of hope, and she was determined to protect it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ms. Johnson received a call from Mrs. Ramirez. "There's going to be a neighborhood association meeting next week," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Mr. Thompson is planning to bring up the garden and push for its removal. We need to be there to support you." Ms. Johnson's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. She knew that if they were going to defend the garden, they needed to present a united front. She quickly organized a gathering at her home, inviting everyone who had supported the garden. As they sat in her living room, the atmosphere was charged with determination. "We can't let Mr. Thompson's negativity win," Ms. Johnson said, her voice steady. "We need to show the neighborhood association that the garden is a positive force in our community. Let's gather testimonials, share our experiences, and highlight the benefits of having this space." The group nodded in agreement, and they began to brainstorm ideas. They decided to create a presentation that showcased the garden's impact, photos of the flowers in bloom, stories of friendships formed, and the joy it brought to families. They also planned to invite local community leaders to speak on the importance of inclusivity and diversity. As the meeting drew to a close, Ms. Johnson felt a renewed sense of hope. They were not just fighting for a garden, they were fighting for a vision of a community where everyone belonged. The next week, they arrived at the neighborhood association meeting, armed with their presentation and a determination to stand together. The room was filled with familiar faces, but Mr. Thompson's presence was unmistakable. He sat at the front, a smug expression on his face, ready to defend his position. As the meeting began, the association president called for discussions on community projects, and Mr. Thompson wasted no time. "I believe we need to address the issue of the community garden," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "It's attracting people who don't belong here, and it's ruining the aesthetic of our neighborhood. We should consider removing it." Gasps echoed through the room, and Ms. Johnson felt her heart race. This was the moment they had prepared for. She stood up, her voice steady but passionate. "I'd like to respond to that," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The community garden is not just a collection of plants, It's a space where we come together as neighbors, regardless of our backgrounds. It has brought joy, friendship, and a sense of belonging to many of us." She presented the photos and testimonials, sharing stories of how the garden had transformed not only the landscape but also the relationships within the community. As she spoke, she could see the expressions of her neighbors shift from skepticism to understanding. One by one, her supporters stood up to share their experiences. Mrs. Ramirez spoke about how the garden had rekindled her love for gardening, while Mr. Patel shared how it had become a gathering place for families. The room buzzed with energy as more neighbors chimed in, echoing the sentiment that the garden was a source of pride, not a problem. As the discussion continued, it became clear that Mr. Thompson's arguments were losing traction. The tide was turning, and the community was rallying around Ms. Johnson and the garden. Finally, the association president called for a vote on whether to keep the garden. With bated breath, Ms. Johnson and her supporters waited as the votes were counted. The room was filled with anticipation, and when the president announced the results, cheers erupted. The motion to keep the garden had passed overwhelmingly. In that moment, Ms. Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over her. Justice had prevailed, not just for her but for the entire community. They had stood together against prejudice and negativity, and they had emerged stronger.